All right, hello and welcome to One Book, One New Orleans, Silence in the Classroom, Banning Books in New Orleans Schools. Yay. All right, so I'm Megan, and for those of you who are new here, new to One Book, I'll give you a brief intro about who we are and what we do. I'll thank some folks, and then I'll turn it over to these four lovely individuals up here. So One Book, One New Orleans picks one book every year, and we encourage everyone in the city to read the same book at the same time with the idea that we're going to grow stronger as a community through a shared reading experience. But when we do that, we have to recognize that approximately 1 in 4 adults in our city struggles with access to literacy and to resources and books. So we do the best we can to bridge that gap and make sure that we reach those 1 in 4. I develop a curriculum around the book, and we get the book and its curriculum free of charge into adult education programs throughout the city. These are adults reading at a 2nd grade level all the way to adults preparing for their high school equivalency. So it's being used across the city to teach adults to read. It's also being used as an educational tool in adult and juvenile prisons. It's being recorded and broadcast to the blind and print handicapped thanks to a partnership with WRBH Reading Radio. If your barrier is poverty, right, you love to read but you can't afford books, we make sure that every branch of the New Orleans Public Library has a copy so that you can go to your neighborhood library and get it for free. And then last but not least, we partner with, I'm sorry, I just said WRBH Reading Radio for the blind and print handicapped, and I'm going over these in my head. All right, so that is the first time in 3 years I have flubbed the intro. Y'all are here for something really special tonight. It's gonna be a long week, people. We're gonna buckle up. Because this is not only Banned Books Week, it's also National Adult Education and Family Literacy Week, and we're doing programming for both. So it's gonna be a long week. Stay tuned to our social media. That's what we do. The book this year is I Feel to Believe by Jarvis DeBerry. It is a collection of his columns for what was then the Times-Picayune. It's 19 years worth. It's incredible. You watch him become a New Orleanian, and a lot of what he talks about is education. So when we were thinking about an event for Banned Books Week, thinking about something around education was front and center in our mind, thanks to Jarvis. So even though he's not here tonight, he is here in spirit. And his book is inspiring this evening, which is one of 12 free family-friendly events we have across the city. If your barrier is transportation, don't worry. We are going to come to you because there is no event twice in a calendar year in the same neighborhood. And if your barrier is childcare, don't worry. All of our events are in places that welcome children. So you'll never see us have an event like at a bar because we want you to be able to bring your kids, have some food, have some great conversation, and feel like you're a part of the community. So before we get rolling any further, I've got to do a few quick thanks and some shout outs. First of all, this program is supported in part by a community arts grant made possible by the City of New Orleans and managed by Arts New Orleans. So thank you, Arts New Orleans, for your support. Thank you also, even though not here but here in spirit, if you were with us in June on the rooftop. You know that One Book, One New Orleans was the beneficiary of the Purple Takeover, a celebration of Prince by DJ Soul Sister. And that is how we got connected with the Virgin Hotels, and in particular, Kelsey James, who is not here, but she works at the Virgin Hotel. She's the event manager, and she reached out to us and offered to let us have another event here. So thank you, Kelsey and the Virgin Hotels, for hosting us. There she is. Thank you also to LitWire and to Sean Monroe for coming out and videoing this event, which will then be uploaded onto our YouTube channel so that if you're a homebound member of our community, you can still see our events on your screen for free. And the biggest shout out tonight is actually going to go, she doesn't know I'm doing this by the way, to my mama. My mama's in the house tonight. The reason the biggest shout out goes to that one is because there would be no One Book, One New Orleans without her having encouraged me to read since before I could talk. And not only did she encourage me to read, but she let me read whatever I wanted. There was no, this is above your grade level. There was no, this might be inappropriate for you. If it was in a book, it was allowed in the house. And that freedom to read really shaped my life and who I am. And we know here in New Orleans and across the country that freedom to read is being restricted more and more in our schools every day. And that's why we're here tonight with these 4 fine people. I'm just going to start on this end and enlarge my print a little bit for my poor eyes. We've got Donyae Lewis, who's been working as an educator for 4 years. He started out with City Year as an AmeriCorps volunteer and is currently at Edna Carr High School. You're getting your master's in secondary ed at Xavier University, and you hold a Bachelor of Arts in journalism. His vision is to create a classroom where students have the tools to revolutionize their lives and transform the world. Give it up for Donyae. Next, we have Katie Wills Evans, a lifelong learner and teacher who has taught in New Orleans for 11 years, currently at the Living School, am I correct? She's also a writer with pieces in Progressive and an abolitionist newsletter, and a media platform called What We Could Become. Give it up for Katie. Next, we have Sarah Vandergriff Kelley, who has been serving as the Legal and Policy Director for the Louisiana's Association of Public Charter Schools for the past 11 years. A New Orleans native, Sarah has an undergraduate degree from Sewanee, the University of the South, a dual JDMA from Loyola University of New Orleans, and has participated in various leadership development programs, including the Aspen Institute, the Anti-Defamation League, and Loyola's Institute of Politics. Give it up for Sarah. And last but not least, former One Book One New Orleans board member David Robinson Morris, PhD. Dr. Robinson Morris, is a scholar, author, philosopher, social justice, and human rights advocate and activist, an educator, philanthropist, community organizer, DEI practitioner, and administrator. He's the founder and chief reimaginary. Did I pronounce that right?
Close.
Close. How do you pronounce it?
Reimagilutionary.
Reimagilutionary, thank you. At the Reimagilution LLC? All right, we're getting it. Every day's a school day, right? Which is a strategic consulting firm working at the intersections of imagination, policy, practice, and prophetic hope to radically reimagine diversity, equity, and inclusion toward racial justice and systemic transformation by engendering freedom of the human spirit and catalyzing the power of the imagination to reweave organizations, systems, and the world for collective healing and liberation. I just talked for 10 minutes, that's longer than I planned to. David is our discussion facilitator for the night, and I'm going to turn it over to him.
That was wonderful. Right now, I'm a big man on a little stool, which is a whole nother situation. I'm so glad that you all are here tonight for this very, very, very important conversation. I'm here to foreground the conversation and to guide our discussion tonight. Our discussants will have no problem having a lively and robust dialogue about banned books and about what is happening here in the city and in the state. But let me give you a bit of information first about what's going on nationally. The American Library Association released a report recently on the rise in censorship efforts. In 2022, there have been 1,651 attempts to restrict access to book titles. But the report emphasizes the role that conservative politics and politicians have played in the escalation of the issue. Conservative groups like Moms for Liberty, our Attorney General in the state of Louisiana, which is leading efforts to have books that they view as inappropriate removed from school libraries. They describe book challenges as a matter of parental choice. Most of those books, though, focus on LGBTQIA issues or have black characters. Let me say that again. Most of those books focus on LGBTQIA issues or have black characters. Like, those are the ones that are targeted the most. In 2009, Toni Morrison's book Song of Solomon was censored in Michigan. In a Michigan AP English course. And at that time, Morrison was still alive. She wrote, "Efforts to censure, starve, regulate, and annihilate us are clear signs that something important has taken place." She wrote, "The thought that leads me to contemplate with dread the erasure of other voices, of unwritten novels, of poems whispered or swallowed for fear of being overheard by the wrong people, outlawed languages flourishing underground, essayists, questions challenging authority never being posed, unstaged plays, canceled films, that thought is a nightmare. As though a whole universe is being described in invisible ink." Tonight, in the context of this national dialogue, we seek to localize these issues by exploring what is lost in banned books and for whose gain. What is suppressed to allow other narratives to dominate and flourish? Why are they being suppressed? If we are our stories, and we are, who are we? Who is allowed voice? And the final question, for what purpose is education, if not for engendering the imagination, right? Catalyzing the spirit of openness and freedom of thought? So we'll begin tonight with all of those questions and with this one. What in the hell is going on here?
People have lost their minds. So I'm Sarah, I'm legal policy. I do a lot of advocacy and I actually work with the Leedsburg School Board, State Board of Education, and the state legislature. So I have actually had a front row to these fights. In the grand scheme of things, why this is all bubbling up from just sort of a local to national perspective is because of COVID lockdowns. In terms of, we're in the midst of this cultural war, and then when lockdown happened, you had a whole bunch of families overlooking and hearing what was happening in the classrooms because the kids were learning at home. So, boom, that immediately gets inserted into sort of the cultural war and inserted into politics and inserted into now the sort of fight over what's being taught, not just in the classroom, but now the fight too over who gets elected to school boards to make those decisions. And so it is not one thing, it is a lot of things, and sort of what happened in COVID is sort of the catalyst behind stirring all this up, and unfortunately putting schools and teachers literally at the center of our national cultural wars that we're having.
Yeah, beautifully said. I think also what is happening, something did go wrong. I concur. I think also what is happening is something that I have resented my entire 11 years in the classroom is I think schools are expected to solve
All the things.
inequities across society, right? And so for the very most part, no fault of their own, many of my students are arriving in, I teach a 12th grade class currently, I've always taught high school, but the vast majority of them are not reading on grade levels, right? It's not because they haven't done what they've been asked to do, it's not because they haven't showed up, like they've done their part. And to some degree that is school's fault. Like I definitely don't want to act like all of our schools are showing up for children in the way that they should. But also our kids are bringing so many things with them. And in the absence of looking at all of the ways that we as a society have failed our children, it becomes a school's responsibility to undo all of those things. And because we're centers of education, then the focus becomes, okay, how do we get kids to an academic standard, which is important. I have no problem with that. But then in this frenzy of, our kids are behind, they're behind. And think about learning loss is like the big, just certain bar that every kid is supposed to hit at a certain age, right? It's giving ableism. Then that's where I think there's another issue if we start to clamp down on and say, this is what each kid must be taught so that they don't fall further behind and there's not more learning loss, which then leads to a lot less teacher autonomy and a lot less of teachers who know our children. We know better than anyone where our kids are. Because they flop those STAR tests and all those reading level tests. Like half of that data is not real, y'all. Those children do not care about those tests. Right, click, because I'm getting a score just for showing up, right? And I think a lot of agency gets taken away from the very people who know how to bring, in the words of Alice Walker, windows and mirrors to children. That agency gets taken away from the very people who have made it their business to know how to give children what they need.
Beautifully said by both of my peers. I think that what I've been gathering is the long-term effects that this has on our children. With regards to their identities, when we start banning these books, what are we saying about the identities of the children in this classroom, right? I think that the other thing with regards to rigor, which you brought up, I think what is interesting when we think about the conversation on banning books is this dialogue of what is considered rigorous, right? That these books with these various identities, can't they also meet the same standards that we are meeting with the current textbooks that we already have? And probably even more because of the dialogue, the group conversations that we can have with these texts. I think it's, as a person that's only been in the education sector for a brief amount of time, I think what I'm always told as a early, teacher in the game is to teach with fidelity. That's what they tell you. You have to teach with fidelity, you have to follow this curriculum. But when I was originally in Jefferson Parish and now I'm in Inspire NOLA, when I was looking at the Wit and Wisdom curriculum and looking at the texts that we have to go through, and I'm looking at the population that I have, most of my population is Black and brown students. But the texts that we are reading, there's no mention of their identity, of their culture, even just New Orleans culture in general. Some of these curriculum that we have don't even reflect the city of New Orleans, let alone the children's identities and what they hold. It does not reflect the city and their culture and what they grew up in. I also think of the long-term effects, once again, of how kids will access information. Because at the end of the day, they will access it, regardless if we don't have it or not. It's just what method are they going to go about accessing it if they can't access it in the classroom. I think about, with regards to sex education, right? For LGBTQIA+ students, there is not any curriculum still to this day with regards to health classes that teaches them how to properly engage with their peers. And so what are they going to do? They're still going to be curious about that. But now how are they going about that? What are they doing with regards to not telling their parents of where they're going and this, that, and the other, because they still want that information, right? And I think that where we stand, especially, we spend so much time with these students more than some of their parents. We are such catalysts for change, not only in just, yes, we need to get them to excel in these standards and go off to college and all of these other things, but we also need to make them better human beings, right? And so when we start banning these texts, we're also telling students that you can't engage in this conversation, you're not capable of having this dialogue. We're also diminishing how we view our students. And at the end of the day, also with this access of this information, all of them with all of their social media and their TikToks and Instagram, they are already having these conversations. I think it's interesting when I'm reading, our first unit right now is Romeo and Juliet, and we're having this conversation of banning books. Let's be honest about Romeo and Juliet. It's a 13-year-old underage girl, and we're talking about her having all of these sexual relations and chastity and all. So what are we actually uncomfortable with? Because we've been comfortable with Romeo and Juliet for years. We were still learning Romeo and Juliet when I was in high school. So we're okay with having certain conversations. I think that's what needs to be taken out of it. When it's related to which identity are you now uncomfortable with the conversation?
Yes. Because
I think that is more so what needs to be talked about, and who's uncomfortable. Not students. Not at all, because we were watching, they have to compare and contrast in this unit, and we had to watch West Side Story. And there was a very racist scene that came up, and we're analyzing and understanding theme, and they were quick to bring up, Mr. Lewis, I think this is about racism. So the kids are ready to have the conversation. Are the adults? I also think, though, with regards to that, you have to be trained enough to have these conversations. I don't think that we should run into talking about these books if certain educators are not ready to. I think it has to take the right amount of training as well with regards to how we move forward as well.
Yeah, that was good. You know, what comes to mind for me when you all are talking is, in what communities is this occurring, right? And for what reason? And what is the imaginative capacity that's trying to be closed down, right? What we know about oppressive systems is that the imagination is the first thing to go in any oppressive system. We saw it during times of enslavement, right? We saw it post-Reconstruction. We saw it during the Jim Crow era. We saw it during fascist regimes, America. We have seen it over and over and over again, right? So what comes to mind for me is this question in banning books around who gets to be human, right, in the process of learning. One of the things you talked about was curriculum, right? There's a huge difference between education and schooling. And some of what you just talked about is schooling, right? Which is meant to discipline the mind in a certain way and to shape being in a certain way. So I guess my question is, there's a question in that, pardon my French, but how do we fuck this up?
From my perspective of what's happening, at least around the rest of the state, is because we don't know any better. So our state as a whole, we are at the bottom of the bottom, historically. We are a state that has never prioritized a formal education. We can always live off the land, so schooling, we can always live off the land, we can always live off football, so school always came second. So now we are also having a reckoning of our state is dying. We can't live off the land as much as we can anymore, and not everyone can play football. So we are trying to play catch up. And in this sort of catch up, we're also realizing I got a third of school districts across the state that are still under active federal desegregation orders from the 1950s and 60s. They have not been permitted out of it by the federal government nearly 60 years later. 1/3. During last year, during the legislative session, when the big Rager-Follow bill, that was the anti-critical race theory bill, all these bills are drafted by national think tanks, and they just shop them around, find a bill author at the different states. And so one of those carbon copies last year was made in that cube. The whole fight made all the headlines of Rager-Follow, the good, the bad, the ugly of slavery, there is no good, whatever. During all the debates that we were having, just to show you just how far we need to go in our state, the legislature on the floor was actually Voice Duplessis here in New Orleans engaging in debate because other legislators were trying to sneak aspects of that bill in throughout the whole session. And he referenced the middle passage, and you had another, is she Senate? Or elected representative, bad enough, period. did not know about it, had never heard about it, and turned out, and she got really embarrassed, and she went back and she made a comment, and she's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And it wasn't just a little like, I'm anxious, I got caught on a hot mic, sort of blank mind. She literally had no idea what he was talking about. And so that's where we are, like just in terms of how far we are. It is a whole different world once you leave outside New Orleans to go to some of our rural parishes, and just to think about generations and generations of leadership, elected leadership, school board leadership, and that cycle passing down of decisions and just passing the same textbooks, because that's what we taught when we were in high school. So how do we come in and sort of institute change? And it's hard, and shaking some people up. So, but it's scary to think about who gets to do some decision making around particularly the rest of the state.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I used to be a civics teacher, and I followed a lot of these things more closely. But I can only really speak from my experience in New Orleans, and I wanna touch on two things. One, respectfully, I think there were people who knew how to do a lot of this, right? And I'm definitely not someone who is gonna sit here and say, everything was great before the storm, right? You know, clearly schools were not perfect then. But I think about how many elders and mentors that I have who have taught in this city or been in schools in this city for decades, who lost their jobs immediately after the storm. I think we would be remiss to not mention the influx of white folks from out of town like myself, who have been the majority of hires in New Orleans schools under the leadership of charter boards and principals at charter schools. And I think there is a lot of wisdom lost there. There was this rumor when I started teaching in 2011 that like, oh, the problem with the schools is these older teachers, they don't want to change their ways, that's not been my experience. My experience as I got to be in places where they had more veteran teachers, was that there were a lot of folks who know how to do this and had a lot to teach me. And I think that within the education system, and we talked about this a little bit before the panel started, there's this idea that the smartest people are the people outside the classroom. That if you're good or you're smart, you're gonna get promoted and you're gonna move up and they're gonna pay you more. You know, I was an assistant principal at one time, and I fought to get back in the classroom, but that's not, people thought I was crazy. Like, people really looked at me, like I used to say, as soon as these student loans are paid off, and people would laugh, and I was like, I get that that's funny, but it's not a joke. The fact that we don't trust the wisdom, and I think, Donyae, you're right, there needs to be training, there also needs to be experience, right? The first time you have a conversation about some of these books that are banned and some of these moments, it's not always gonna go well, right? There's wisdom that comes with experience. There's wisdom in the teacher's lounge where you can go to somebody who's taught Romeo and Juliet and can talk to you about a text to pair with it. So I think that's one thing. And I think what happened, what went wrong, it's intentional, right? I taught U.S. history for a few years, and the U.S. history curriculum in the state of Louisiana starts in the year 1891. How are you supposed to understand the United States if you don't learn about anything that happened before 1891? Who built this place? Right? And so there are really intentional statewide decisions being made. And there are these opportunities where it's like, join this committee, the LDOE, and I actually, like, not to shade the LDOE, I do see there has been changes within that department, even folks who are working really hard to change things. But I do think at every level there is a fear there's a fear to, and you said it, Donyae, of what kids can handle. The majority of my children have handled more in 16, 17, 18 years of life than most of us in this room. If we're talking about public school students in New Orleans. You know, Edward Buckles, shout out, talking about in the car, just released on HBO Katrina Babies. And my kids' pushback was, those aren't the Katrina babies, we're the Katrina babies. I was born the day we got to Houston, right? So don't talk to me about what my children can't handle. Adrienne Marie Brown says, if you trust the people, they become trustworthy. We don't trust our children, and we don't trust our teachers to be able to have these conversations. And if we're gonna really be honest, there are a lot of folks who hate queer people, who hate trans people, right? And when we choose not to have a single book in our curriculum, a single poem, maybe we excerpt Audre Lorde, but we do a piece that doesn't talk about the fact that she is a lesbian, right? What that says to our children is there is no space for you here. And when 67% of queer youth consider or attempt suicide, I don't think that's acceptable. And I think it's very clear. And our children see it, and they are smarter than we think they are.
It's always hard going after y'all. I feel like I want to switch the direction. No, but y'all are hitting the nail on the head, and I think that there has never been, talking with staff members, there's never been a cultural competency factor of hiring teachers. And I think that mentioning what you said with regards to, of course, the city had problems before Katrina, and that's valid. But post, it was really about, okay, we're gonna revamp, and how we're gonna revamp, and we're gonna get all these people from Teach for America and City Year, and we're gonna kick all these folks out. And it was less about who's gonna relate to these kiddos, who understands them, their culture, their language, their dialect. It wasn't about that. It was get out with the old and in with the new. And I think that's always kind of been the model historically when if you look at anything that's been passed, it's never, to me, has a cultural competency component attached to it. And I also think how schools are measured. I was fortunate enough this summer to work with this Urban Leaders Fellowship, which we got to do laws on educational policy. And now that it's over, I can be a little more candid with you all about the laws. I was on like a sworn to secrecy when I was working for them. But it was so interesting because the team that I was on, we were working on social emotional learning and making a accountability framework for the city, because there is no accountability framework for social emotional learning in the city of New Orleans. And what's so interesting to me about that is that there's no question about that social emotional learning is needed ASAP. Mental health in the city, our students, specifically our marginalized identities, is at a high right now. But the problem is, once again, going back to training, you cannot tell someone to teach a social emotional learning curriculum if they are not even aware of their own SEL, right? And so we have adults in the building thinking that they are doing something that is restorative justice, when in fact you're just continuing to marginalize the student. You're continuing to microaggress the student because you weren't trained enough on how to do this restorative justice circle. They just throw you in there and say, do a restorative justice circle today, right now, because your students are having a conflict. And so when we don't look at things from a racial equity lens, right? Because equality and equity are two different things. It starts to become no wonder we're repeating the same history over and over and over again, because the foundation has always been whack. So no wonder we keep repeating history. I think also, just to just nuggets of things that I've experienced. There was one school where I had this shirt on. I still own this shirt. And it said, why be racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic when you could just shut up? So that was the t-shirt, right? And I was told by an administrator, you can't wear that. And I was like, oh, it's the shut up part probably, right? That's probably what's getting, I get it, the shut up was too. No, what if we have to explain the transphobic and the homophobic to parents? What are you going to explain? To not be, I would hope that it's to not be transphobic and to not be homophobic. But it's one of those conversations once again, and I've worn the t-shirt at other schools where it hasn't been a conversation. Who's uncomfortable with this? I also think it's interesting, at that same school, there were teachers that just decided not to teach social studies. They said, we're stressed, we're overwhelmed, so there was an elementary school, and the English teachers were supposed to teach English and social studies. They just chose not to teach the social studies curriculum. Some teachers. Wow, right? A very important, let's not just even think about leave and testing and all the questions that they're gonna see. Social studies, the study of human nature and how we all interact with each other, it's just being thrown out the window at some schools. Do I think it's kind of valid with regards to all that understaffing and the teacher shortage? Absolutely. But I think once again, when we think of where are these loopholes or potholes, right, of our educational school system, it's all of it. And I think it comes down to not necessarily, I think we have to stop putting the children in they're the reason, as you said. No, as the adults, what are we doing with regards to our trainings at the beginning of the school year? Why is it the fact that we have a diversity and inclusion training once at the beginning of the school year, and it's 80 minutes and we're clicking through slides, and then we never talk about this for the rest of the school year? No wonder we're having banned books. Because we're not even taking this seriously as educators to have these conversations. I think we have to check a lot of boxes, and that's why certain conversations are not had. But I think with the identities that I hold, I can't be silent on these issues. Because I can't. Because my life doesn't allow it. Nor do these students' life allows it. So having a choice to be silent about these conversations is a privilege. Because some people do not have a choice of when and where and how they're going to have these conversations.
What strikes me is that banning books is not about children at all. Right? Never has been, never is, never will be. So the question becomes this is our last panelist question, and we'll open it up to the floor. The question becomes, in our very conservative state, two questions, two very pointed questions. What is the fear, one, and what needs to be healed? Two.
You want to start first? You go.
Cool. But now we got this really deep one. I was like, we waited for the deepest one. No, I'll start with what needs to be healed, because so much. I think even though it's not a new thing for these children, or maybe for us, with regards to the injustices in our world. I think of what transpired in 2020, of having to be locked down and you couldn't see nothing but the world falling apart. Let's start there. Because kids are opening up Twitter, seeing their peers or people that look like them get murdered as soon as they open the map, right? We have students still in hallways that are being called outside of their name because of their identities and their sexualities. What needs to be healed, I think, is a very loaded question. But I think what needs to be fueled again and to be revolutionized again, I think people need to see that their identities and who they are matter. I think that with regards to, remind me your first question after what was needs to be healed. What was the first one that you asked me? What are we afraid of? the norm being expanded of what we think is supposed to be normal in this country, right? I think also knowledge scares people. What are they going to do with all this knowledge? I think it's interesting when we talk about, well, what happens when we start talking with children about racism? Are the white kids, are they going to feel guilty? No, they're going to come with us and join the revolution too. They're going to join the march. They're going to see that their peers have been going through some crazy things, and it was going to teach them to be empathetic about what they're going through. I think once again, we're underestimating what the kids are going to do with this information. It's not going to be a guilt trip or they're going to feel now that they are silenced, they can't have it. Actually, the quite opposite. I think what more so needs to be talked about is that what are you going to do with that information? And how are you going to handle that conversation as an adult in that building, right? I think that you have to be trained enough and aware enough that different individuals are coming into this conversation with different experiences, and it's not easy. It's not going to be solved in one classroom setting. One day, one lesson, we're done. February's over. We celebrated Juneteenth. It's a forever conversation. So I think you also have to be comfortable with the uncomfortable and knowing that it's not just going to be Monday. It's going to be something that we are lifelong learners and we're going to do every single day. But I'm doing it, I'm showing up as your educator because I care about you and I see you. And what's happening now is you're saying that I don't see you. I don't care about your identity. And that's what needs to be healed.
Yeah, I'm thinking two things. Sometimes I think education is just like the most systemic, widespread hazing experiment of all time. Like the amount of times that I hear, not just adults outside of schools, but adults that work in schools say, well, like, this is what happened to me and I turned out fine. And I'm like, did you? You're trying to out 13-year-old a 13-year-old right now. Like, that doesn't seem healed to me. And I say that to be funny, but also like, how many of us felt seen and cared for and loved and challenged and treated with dignity on a daily basis in school? And I think sometimes those of us who choose to be teachers and to work in schools, we did. You know, there's the occasional folks who are like in detention and now they turn into a teacher and they go home and their teacher's like, you? But I think for the most part, like, schools are full of people for whom schools worked. And that's a lack of perspective. And so I think sometimes our relationship to our own school experience as adults and what we were asked to do and told we couldn't do needs to be healed. And I think on the, what is the fear? I guess I'm gonna get personal real quick. You know, when I came out to my mother, and my mother is very like, my mother, is down for the cause, right? But when it was me, she was so scared. And like her reaction was not great. And when we talked about it later, it was, you know, it's not that I think it's anything wrong with it, I just know how much harder your life is gonna be. And that's very real. And I think sometimes we're afraid if we give our children permission to be their full selves, or if we don't coach them into respectability, that they won't make it. And I think to go back to what needs to be healed, unfortunately, no matter how much, they could be the, like, I'm not going to name names, but we know plenty of people who are very respectable, who had wonderful careers that helped people who were asleep in their beds. And respectability did not protect them. Right? And so I think we are afraid that we can't protect our children. And so we grasp a little tighter sometimes. And we think if we can just keep them children, you know, if we just don't talk to them about hard history, if we just don't, then maybe things will magically get better before they leave high school. And I don't see that happening. I don't know about y'all. I don't see that coming. And I think the last thing I want to say is we have to be really careful too. I think we should be afraid of telling kids the whole truth and not giving them a chance to figure out what to do with it. I think the flip side is we say, let's talk about a new trauma every week. And we can say, and we can read all of, you know, like I'm gonna teach Ta-Nehisi Coates, and then I'm gonna teach, and then I'm gonna teach, and it's just black trauma and brown trauma, and that's all we teach to our children. And there's no space for joy, and also in a civics class, we need to be talking about what are we gonna do about it? When's the next meeting? Here's the link for public comment, right? So how do we say, here's what it has been, and I'm not gonna lie to you. And you can feel everything you wanna feel about this. And what are we gonna do with that? And I think that is how we do the healing. It's like, let's be honest. And then let's tell you, unfortunately, just like everybody before us, like we've been fighting, and now you have to take the baton. And let's not say, we did not fix it because we're not trying hard enough. And our ancestors didn't not fix it because they weren't trying hard enough. You just do your part. And that's how we all heal. Is let's be honest and let's just each do our part.
From sort of the more state level political sort of perspective, it's just change is hard. When you talk about, I mean, you all have already said it too, like when so many people go to talk about education, they talk about from their own experience. Well, how I went to school. So imagine being as a legislator and it's a whole bunch of very older people, usually who look a certain way. Well, when I was in school, and that's their only point of reference and context. And so change is just hard, and for a lot of people, there's a lot of change coming at them in all sorts of directions, and so instead they just want to retreat into a shell, right? This is sort of the basis of where this cultural war is coming from. And again, when you look across the state, there's places where meaningful integration has never happened still, you know? And so when we talk about, well, what are ways we can change, and we're always about like politics is local as it can get. Beginning with your sort of your neighborhood community and reaching out. But also where I see some of the issues that I get frustrated is like New Orleans loves to live in a bubble. And I need some of you all to start expanding outside your comfort zone of the bubble.
And our schools aren't integrated. New Orleans schools are not integrated.
Yeah, that's a whole other topic. Right, back another day, we get to go into that. But it's also, it's just such a different reality. Again, you have an elected legislature, been there, she is not one of my favorites at all. And but I got up there and acknowledged, what are you talking about middle passage? Never had a clue, was never taught it, was not in her books, and she's coming from a whole community. And so it is that struggle, that fight, that hope we have to overcome. So how do we find more bridges, more pathways, more like you're going to be okay, this is how we're going to heal, because it's all levels of healing. And I do think some of the, who you elect matters, but I do think some of the folks really do get it, because guess what, like, our state is dying. We have the highest rate of population decline in the country, and we are literally being washed away. And we're getting bypassed while New Orleans used to be the sexy city for lots of different reasons. It's now Austin, it's now Nashville. And it's always Atlanta still. And so we're literally getting bypassed. And so people realizing, like, holy smokes, if we don't do something to change, our state literally will stop existing. And so how do we just continue to push our elected officials? This stuff matters. What you do, what you tell or don't tell a school, how you can and what you can teach, it all circles into, is this a place people want to live? And so we're having some very hard conversations, and I say keep up the fight.
Thank you all for that. You know, before I open it up for questions, one of the things that I didn't hear was that, you know, we opened up with, this is really a conservative movement.
Yeah.
Right? And conservatism, rightly or wrongly, is equated to whiteness, a certain type of whiteness, right? And in my opinion, whiteness is a psychosis, right? There are some, when someone lives outside of reality, that's a mental illness, right? Shutting down books, banning books is shutting down conversation and closing down possibility, right? It is closing windows, barring doors into alternate circulating truths, right? It is a very intentional thing to discipline the mind to think in a certain way, right? And it is deeply political. All education is political, right? So to ban a book is a political move to keep us in a certain reality, right? Which does a whole host of things that I'm not going to get into tonight. But the short of that is, white people are crazy. Okay. That's true. Let's open the floor for questions.
I have one. What is it that you were talking about? That you said the legislator, she didn't know what it was? I don't know what it is.
The Middle Passage, the bringing of the slaves across the Atlantic to Soviet slavery. And so it was a big debate. It was 2 years ago. This is why we made all the national news around it. But when you're then having on the House floor of our state legislature of 2 elected bodies engaging in a conversation around what to teach, what not to teach, because Royce was like, well, if you're bringing this curriculum, I'm bringing this curriculum. Yep. And she was like, what is that? And then she admitted later, she's never been taught. So your point is about like, what do you teach? And you think about some of these communities, and to your point, what they decide to teach, it keeps a narrative. Power, power is corruption, and it is hard to let go, and it is in a deep southern state, it is a very complicated issue. But it's 2022, right? And those are some of our elected leaders of our state. For the first time ever hearing and thinking that, oh, what I was taught is not actually accurate.
Questions?
I don't really have a question. I just want to say thank you, because it's so many times that people who used to teach back in the day before charters came on, and they rarely hear that perspective that they have something to contribute, or that other folk could learn from those people. But I also want to say that I think it's like teachers, new teachers like you, who, like you guys, I mean, it's like you guys who are able to bring the awareness. So like in our program, we work with new teachers, and so in our program there's a lot about things that are happening now that we don't know, and we have to talk to people and engage with people and learn from other people. And I think that mix of it could be something that's a part of the fix. It's like helping to educate and helping to give people the knowledge that they need to be able to understand, and then trusting our teachers to know. Like, I think back in the day when I taught, there was a trust of all of my parents, all the students that came to me. If there was a banned book, I would just send out a letter saying, hey, will you give us permission? They're going to be cussing in here, we're going to be rolling in here, we la 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 la. And parents will, oh yeah, if you're doing it, I'm good, I'm signing on. So I think that kind of trust needs to be rebuilt. So thank you.
Yeah. And I think too, those relationships that you're talking about, right? So like I've looped with my kids this year. I'm teaching the same group I taught last year. So my kids' parents know me. It's Miss Katie's class? Okay, right? But, and we were talking before this started, teachers are not being treated well, y'all. I don't think anybody was under the illusion that like we are getting luxurious treatment, but you know, when I started teaching, my mama is a nurse, and she said, don't let them know how much you care, because that's how they get you. And because both students and teachers within a full city, the only full city charter model, everybody can move, right? So when you talk about the children at a school that you worked at didn't have social studies for a year. So now, 3 years later, I've got some kids who didn't have social studies at all. I've got some kids who were taught from a textbook that said enslaved people were migrants. And then I've got some kids, at least in high school, who read the autobiography of Assata Shakur in 6th grade, right? And so now we're all But I think to your point, and I love it, the more we can all be in community. One of the greatest schools that I ever worked with, our most veteran teacher had taught in the same classroom since 1985, and our youngest teacher was 21 years old. And we loved that. Like, that was a thing that we were so proud of within our departments, because there are a lot of things that people had right. And there were also a lot of things that folks just didn't know any better, right? And when you know better, my angel would say, you do better. But you also, like, can't know better if you're not taking a lot of perspectives. Because to your point, I think it's easy to demonize and villainize people. But I do think that the very vast majority of people in the state of Louisiana want children to be well. And I think teaching, again, to everyone's point, unlike being a doctor, right? Everybody went to school. So everybody thinks they know what good teaching is and how to do it. And I think it's just a moving target, but that could be something that we all figured out as a community. But when your teachers are changing schools so often, and when children are transferring to 2 to 3 different schools within a year because they're not being treated well, because the bus ride is an hour and a half, because they're not getting suspended, but they're being told not to come to school at certain schools, you don't get a chance to build that community where even if a book is banned, I can say, I'm sending home a permission slip, have your people sign it and I did this last year, have your people sign it if you're not allowed to read the book, right? I ain't get any permission slips back, right? But I also called my 1 or 2 parents who I knew might have a concern and talk to them. But you can only do that if you know your people.
Yes.
Any others? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to push back a little. I don't know if everybody wants our students to be well. The question becomes, which students do you want to be well, right? And for what reason, right? The research shows us that, we are literally building prisons. Right? This is a concerted effort to stand up a whole economy that will privilege others over some, right? So those things, these conversations have to be talked about, right? And this is the fear around a whole lot of those books that are banned, right? Hopefully, once you know better, you do better, right? But even if you do know better, because I do think some of our legislators know better, right? Better is a choice, and they can choose not to do or be better, and a number of them have, right? Because of power, because of money, right? And because of fear of losing their position. Right? So those things are ever present for me. And I love that your mother said, don't let them know how much you care. My grandmother would always say, never let them know how smart you are. Right? There are these little rivers of fugitivity, right? Where you become subversive in the classroom, right? Because the moment you're smart, you're targeted in this way. Right? All right. Let's give our folks a round of applause. This has been a wonderful conversation. Go buy a damn book. Right? Go buy them all. Go read Lewis Stein. Look at the American Library Association's website and look at this year's 10 most banned books. And go buy every damn one of them.
What website is it?
The American Library Association.
Oh.
And give them out as gifts to your teacher friends to put in their school library. Thank you, Megan.
Y'all, let's give it up. Thank you guys so much. I'm not going to talk another 10 minutes, I swear. I'm just going to tell you about Saturday. On Saturday, the 24th of this month, which is 6 days from now, we'll be having a community book giveaway. And yes, there will be banned books on the book tables. Yay. So come out to 1930 Independence Street. We're partnering with the Donald Harrison Foundation. the Guardians Institute, and there'll be a presentation about their Sankofa Saturday program. There'll be live music, there'll be snacks, there'll be free books. Come out and enjoy a nice afternoon from 1:30 to 3:30. Also, if you're getting hungry, the Virgin Hotels, if you mention One Book, One New Orleans in this event, will give you 15% off your bill if you dine here. So thank you to Virgin Hotels New Orleans. Thank you to all of you for coming out on a Monday night to hear about banned books and schools. And we hope to see you at the next event. Bye.